welcome to Depth Insights. This is the show where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for those who are interested and active in the field of depth and union psychologies. And I'd like to welcome my guest today, Craig Chalquist, who is a core faculty member of John F. Kennedy University and an adjunct faculty at CIIS, Prescott College, and Antioch University. And Craig is also, among other things, a permaculture designer and a certified master gardener through the University of California Cooperative Extension. As if that wasn't enough, he's also the author of 6 books and the editor of 2 anthologies. Hi, Craig. Thanks for being here with me.
Hi, Bonnie. How are you?
I'm great. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and I wanted to congratulate you, first off, on your latest book, the anthology that you've just released called Rebearths, Conversations with World Ensouled. I know it's only been out for a couple of months, but everybody that I've talked to has had awesome reviews of it. Would you just maybe share with us for a minute about how the idea came to you to do that book and what was your motivation to follow through?
Sure, I'd love to. I published a book a couple of years ago called Terra Psychology, Terra Psychology, and because I was very interested, I still am interested actually, in the deep connections between psyche and place, between what goes on inside of us and the places where we live. And there's been a lot of environmental psychology to study those connections, but it tends to remain at sort of a surface level, which is fine if that's what you're interested in. But to me, it's not really about how sunlight influences mood or patterns of movement in crowds or things like that. I'm more interested in how places show up in our dreams and in our bodies and those sorts of deep connections that depth psychology also tends to pay attention to by looking at symbolism and myth and all sorts of interesting things like that. So after Terra Psychology came out, I discovered that there was actually quite a few people who were working in a similar direction. And so about a year ago, I thought, well, why don't we all do an anthology? There's so many different ways to come at this sort of deep work with place, and so that was the origin of the book, and I'm so happy with how it turned out. It's been an honor to be an editor for so many really thoughtful, fine pieces of writing about place and heart and psyche and soul.
Absolutely. I have also been deeply affected by this, and I think, part of the way that I understand it, and it's what I'm hearing you say, is that we can look at the natural world around us and see the features in the landscape and understand how we have these same features within us. If you look at a rock, for example, and you see cracks or you see cleavages or there's fault lines in the earth, we have those same things within us, within our psyche, within our own structures. And by understanding those kinds of things and the relationship that we have, it's kind of that old alchemical as above, so below. What we see outside is also what we have within. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I would say also that the dualism of thinking that they're separate somehow and that we stand above the natural world and that the pathology of the world doesn't get inside of us is a large part of the blindness that drives things like global warming and the using of resources past their carrying capacity and all the other crises we now face.
Yes, the capacity that we have really determined that because we can think and because we can manipulate the natural world with science and technology, that we have the right to do that is not even, actually the trouble I think is not just that we have that, I think it's that we don't even question that, It's much more about, it's the unconsciousness around it. I mean, I'm even speaking of myself in daily life, how many times do you do things that you don't even think about that actually if you start observing them, you realize how many paper cups you're using or when you take that bottled water or whatever it is that we're doing that is going to have an impact, and what right do we really have to do that? Yeah,
it's such a subtle network of relationships, and we have such a huge cultural blind spot against looking at it that I was out walking at Kennedy the other day, and there's this huge freeway behind the school, and I started to wonder, where that freeway is in our psyches here, in our studies. It goes in 2 different directions. How are we? And questions like that we're not really taught to ask, but that Terra Psychology looks at.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And that reminds me of something I was writing the other day, which is not quite a complete work, but it's about light pollution and how because we have diluted the night sky so much, we don't have as much focus on the moon as say, traditional people have had. And, we're seeing all these things that are happening, say, to the frogs, where they're being born more and more with terrible deformities and all kinds of very odd diseases, and, a huge number of them are vanishing as well. And I'm wondering what the relationship is to, the fact that we're creating the light pollution, the moon is kind of vanishing, and then the frogs, which are actually a symbol of the goddess in ancient cultures, are the ones that are bearing the brunt of this. So it's all hugely interconnected.
Yeah, and somebody needs to spend some more time looking into all those relationships. The Jungian side of me, when I hear about the moon not being visible anymore, makes me wonder about what Jungians often refer to as the feminine dimension of experience, and everything that the moon represents mythologically, and all those associations. And the stars, we can't see the stars anymore. We can go on the internet and find out that Lindsay Lohan is being charged with a felony for stealing jewelry. Those stars we can see, right? But the ones up in the sky, we can't look at anymore. Just the fallen ones.
Yeah, that's right. And it's ironic. You use a bit of a wordplay there with stars and stars, but that's exactly what we're talking about from a Jungian and a depth psychological standpoint. That's the power of looking at something symbolically. Which actually leads me to my next question. I wondered, all of this, of course, falls within the realm of depth psychology. Can you just tell us maybe what your definition of depth psychology is? How would you explain it to someone?
I have a couple of definitions, actually, depending on who I'm talking to. The one that I use the most for people that have no idea of what it is, well, a lot of times when I say depth psychology, they'll go death psychology, like in keeling over, and I have to say, no, it's DEPTH, Yeah. Of course, according to Hillman, they do relate to each other, soul and death and all that. But anyway, usually when I explain it, like if I'm teaching a class to students that are new to it, I say something about how depth psychology is the tradition of research, clinical work, and cultural criticism that come out of the pioneering work primarily of 5 people. So I add a few more than, for instance, Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is my alma mater, it's a great school. They tend to emphasize Freud and Jung, who, of course, are 2 of the pioneers of depth psychology. I tend to include 3 others. I include the work of Pierre Janet, who developed a fully depth psychological system of evaluation and treatment in about the mid-1800s. I include the work of William James, whose pioneering studies of psychology and religion were such a huge influence on Jung. And I also include Alfred Adler, who looked a lot at things like the uses that clients make of their symptoms in psychotherapy. So all of those different pioneers worked on a field that looks at the relation between consciousness and unconsciousness in very deep ways, which is why we also pay attention to things like symbol and myth and folklore, where so much rich connection with the depths often occurs spontaneously, art as well. Right. The other thing I often go into is that depth psychology has, from its inception, been looking at what's been cast out of mainstream consciousness, the borders of consciousness and culture. So the work of Janet and Freud and others looked at the pathological that was being cast out of consciousness, and then Jung came along and brought spiritual impulses into it that had been cast out of mainstream consciousness. And then the work of Watkins and Lorenz, looking at psychology as a form of liberation of the oppressed. So all the while, depth psychology has been enriching itself through a century of work, trying to hear what has been silenced.
Yes, and that's very powerful, because the truth is that kind of information is available to all of us. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier and looking at the natural world. A lot of the time we just don't pay attention. So the natural extension or I guess a piece of depth psychology is, first off, paying attention, and then second off, being able to identify what is actually being said or emerging from that silence or what's been repressed. And therefore, you can identify a symbol and then start working with that symbol. And so the process becomes one that is very organic and also can sort of take on a life of its own.
Yes. And you mentioned symbols, and there's an important distinction that Jung made between the symbol and the sign. And, of course, the sign is what we usually think of it when we say symbol. It's a representation of something that's known, like a stop sign says stop, and words mean things and all that. But in depth psychology, a symbol is much more than that. It's a connection to something that's ultimately not only unconscious but mysterious. So when we work with symbols, we work in a permanent uncertainty not about exactly what it is that we're dealing with. It's trying to emerge from the depths, something that we can never pin down in empirical concepts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's Edward Whitmont, who was a Jungian analyst and wrote an amazing book. I remember him saying in that book that for every unknown thing that we have on the inside, for every unknown object on the inside or within our unconscious, there is an object that we can know on the outside that correlates with it. And when I heard that the first time, that made so much sense to me. All of a sudden, I started to see everything around me in a whole new way, because I realized that everything that I see, whatever my eyes rest on, there's something within me that is being represented by that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That was cool. While I'm thinking about it, too, I just wanted to mention, because as you were talking about Janet and James and the whole kind of history of depth psychology, there's a great book called The Discovery of the Unconscious by Henry Ellenberger. If anyone's interested in the history of depth psychology, I found that it's a pretty thick book, but it does a really great job of explaining really the origins and the history of a lot of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it should be required reading for every basic course in depth psychology.
Yes, that's probably where I got it. Yeah. So, Craig, let's shift gears here a little bit and just switch to another topic, which I know has been very important to you, especially recently. It's something that's heating up for you, and that is something that you're calling deep education. Can you explain that to us and tell us what's going on in that realm?
Yeah, as an educator, I conduct periodic, ongoing self-inquiry about what it is I'm actually doing. And I noticed that as I've worked in the classroom over the years and also in my writing, my educational interests tend to constellate around what I think of as deep transformation, both in individuals and in the culture at large, which, of course, is a very depth psychological consideration and value, So deep education for me is the kind of education that pushes past the surface, the things that we learn, the mathematics and how to parse sentences and all those very necessary things. But deep education looks below all that at the underlying fantasies, the underlying archetypes, and tends those as well, with the idea that if we can understand things in a deep way, we have a better chance of living on this planet in ways that are actually healthy for us and the planet as well. So to get sort of more of a concrete example, I've been recently thinking about what it would look like to study one thing in particular from a deep education standpoint, which usually goes by the name of globalization. Anybody that's been watching the news, it's obvious that for all the good and the many good things that industrialization has done for us as a species, it also has a heck of a shadow, particularly when you think about things like global warming. And so a lot of my activist friends and colleagues, when they think about multinational corporations, big petroleum companies, big pharmaceuticals, industrial companies, that kind of thing, approach them from an adversarial perspective of how can we kill the corporations and how can we fight them off and things like that, And I'm not criticizing them for that, but a deep education standpoint would ask, what is going on here that we could understand from a mythological perspective? Mm-hmm. And so as a mythology teacher, it reminds me of how in many mythologies, when the heroic figure is getting ready for the initiation, oftentimes the giants show up, like threshold guardians, they're big, challenging figures that test you in various ways, So I'm entertaining the fantasy that our species is about to cross a threshold from psychological adolescence into a fuller maturity, and that multinational corporations represent the threshold guardians. And mythology tells me that you don't get through the threshold by killing the guardians, or by going to war against them or having a revolution. You have to understand what response they're asking from you. And so I think it'd be interesting to look at it from that perspective.
Yes, that's a really fascinating way to describe it, and it actually, putting it into that kind of a mythological context is so helpful, because that's a story that everybody can relate to, no matter where you are in your own process or education or exposure. We all know mythology to some extent. We've heard some of the stories. And so what about the educational piece of it? I mean, is there a way to educate the corporations, for example, or is it much more at a grassroots kind of level where it would be those who are wishing to initiate change who would be able to take advantage of this concept of deep education?
It's a big question. It seems to me that there's many different ways to work this, but the one I think that needs to be prioritized up front, I think, is to understand what's happening from a mythological, archetypal, depth psychological point of view before we act. I'm also, in my work, I'm regarded as an eco-psychologist, and one of my colleagues has been saying that things are so dire now with rising temperatures and so forth that we don't have any more time for reflection and we have to act. And I couldn't disagree more, actually. I think it's action without reflection that's been one of the things that got us into trouble. So creating spaces to reflect on what is it, how should we respond if we're in the position of trying to get initiated collectively, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to say to the giants, And I think that as we work that, the other thing about giants is they're not all bad guys. There's corporations that do tremendous good in the world as well. And I'm thinking of Ray Anderson, who's the CEO of Interface, which makes carpets, and reading in a book, I think it was by Bill McKibben, that Anderson was considered a polluter and a destroyer and so forth, and he really took that to heart, and he started rebuilding his company from the inside out, and now his goal is to have a totally zero-waste carpeting business, and he goes all over the lecture circuit telling other CEOs and telling big audiences about how to do this. And so I like to think that transformative educational work at all different levels can create more opportunity for the Ray Andersons of the world to wake up and see what they're doing. Others will simply have to be held accountable. And when cultural values shift and it becomes not okay to pollute and chew up the earth, then I think more companies will start getting on board with doing things differently.
Yes, I agree, and I think part of that, which you alluded to but maybe didn't say specifically, which I'll say now, and that is so much of this work begins with the individual. It's just like your example of the carpet company. I mean, if he wasn't out there doing that, then there's no way that he would be able to affect anybody else. And so by kind of like the world begins at home, right? If you start with yourself and do the smallest thing, it's always surprising to me what the ripple effect can do. And even if you don't see it, you still know that, if you drop a rock into a pond, the ripples are going to go out from there. And so it's probably not the right approach to say we're going to change the world by, approaching the giants. That got a lot of people, including Odysseus, in trouble, when he approached the Cyclops directly. And so it's really important to, as you say, to take a step back and really be reflective about what is it that we're doing here. But combined with action, we can't. It's holding the opposites, which of course is a very depth psychological idea as well. Yes,
and I do think there are plenty of people in the corporate world who'd be interested in some of these ideas. I've talked to a few of them, and it catches there too. So, another thing, too, you mentioned ripples. According to systems theory, when you talk about not just ripples, but the way systems interact and feedback structures and all kinds of other complexities, we know that when a system approaches chaos, when a big system is ready to fall apart, then just a whisper can begin to redesign the system all the way across at many different levels. So it doesn't even have to build up geometrically like, one person influences 10 who influence 10 more and so on. It can just be the smallest change, but if it's at the right time, the time of kairos, as the ancient Greeks like to say, the right time, it can have influence far beyond what anyone could ever predict.
Yes, I think that's very true, and I think there's also an element of trust that has to go into that, into the idea that if we're willing to do the work, whether that's in reflection or whether it's in outward action, that will have an effect, and we have to trust that collectively there will be a critical mass when things really start to change in the world in the way that we treat it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we just have a couple of minutes remaining, Craig. I wonder if you wanted to comment briefly on, I know you have another book that came out last year which has been really highly rated. You've done a lot of publicity about it. You mentioned it in passing, but I wanted to make sure that we talk about it for just a quick second, and that is the book Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind, which I believe you co-wrote with Linda Bazell. Is that correct?
We were co-editors.
Yeah. Will you just tell us a little bit about that real briefly, and that way people can pick that up if they're interested?
Yeah, it's there was a book that came out in 1995 called Ecopsychology that introduced the study of the study of the health and pathology of our relations with the natural world. And ecopsychology has been active since then. What we wanted to do was to give an example of applied ecopsychology, which is ecotherapy. And that word's been around for about the same amount of time. It's an umbrella term that refers to including the natural world in relationships of healing. So most people know it as things like gardening therapy and work with animals and wilderness excursion work and so forth. But ecotherapy at its heart is a circular relation with the natural world such that the nature itself is enhanced in the relationship. It's taken account of. And so Sierra Club Books published the Ecotherapy book, and we've been interviewed by, a bunch of people, Time Magazine, and there's been some newspaper stories about it. And I was interviewed by Yes Magazine about 5 or 6 months ago, I think. But the idea seems to really resonate with people that it just makes sense to reestablish contact with nature in order to be fully healthy as human beings.
Mm-hmm. And, the piece I love that you just alluded to as well is that nature is also benefiting from it. It's a mutually beneficial cycle, as you referred to it. That's great. Well, that's going to do it for us pretty much today. I just want to let you know that you can find Craig Chalquist at his website, which is chalquist.com. That's CHALQUIST.com. And you also have the Ecotherapy website, which is ecotherapyheals.com. And you're on Facebook as well. Craig, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. I really enjoyed this.